The United States and Iran have once again faced each other as if they were standing one step away from a definitive rupture. At the center of this tension are public threats, stalled negotiations, military movements, and a Middle East that once again seems to be living under a permanent state of strain. The crisis between Washington and Tehran did not arise from a single speech, nor from one isolated night of threats. It was built over weeks of mounting pressure, the return of ultimatums, the American insistence on imposing limits on Iran's nuclear program, and Tehran's sharp response, which began to treat any new attack as the beginning of a war. Around this, the regional environment grew more unstable, more unpredictable, and for many analysts, more dangerous than it first appeared. What makes this moment especially sensitive is that the dispute is no longer only diplomatic. The conflict has also moved on to military ground. There are reports of a reinforced American troop presence in the Middle East, along with an increased strategic deployment by the United States in the region. This does not necessarily mean that a full war has been declared, but it does indicate that the tension has moved out of the realm of words and into the logic of armed intimidation. When that happens, every move begins to be read as a warning, a response, or a threat. On the American side, Donald Trump's rhetoric once again moved to the center of the crisis. At different moments, he pressed Iran with harsh language, said time was running out, and suggested that attacks could be resumed if Tehran did not accept conditions Washington considered non-negotiable. This direct, aggressive, and calculated style was part of a strategy that blends psychological pressure, displays of force, and an attempt to force an agreement from a position of superiority. In international crises, that kind of posture can intimidate, but it can also push the situation toward a breaking point. On the Iranian side, the message was equally hard. Tehran responded by saying that any American military action would be interpreted as the beginning of a war. Rather than publicly retreating, Iran continued insisting on resistance, demanding broader guarantees, rejecting submission, and reinforcing its willingness to react. This position is not just rhetoric. It is part of an Iranian political tradition that seeks to project strength in the face of foreign pressure and preserve its image of autonomy amid international siege. Meanwhile, the backdrop remains Iran's nuclear program, a subject that for years has served as the main axis of tension between the two countries. Washington wants to contain, limit, or completely dismantle Tehran's nuclear capacity. Iran, in turn, says that its program has strategic and sovereign purposes, and that it will not accept demands that compromise its security or regional standing. The impasse is deep, because this is not just a technical dispute. It is a battle over power, control, and geopolitical survival. The situation becomes even more delicate because of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important maritime routes on the planet. Any threat in that passage immediately alters the global perception of risk because it involves oil, international trade, and the energy security of several countries. In other words, the crisis between the United States and Iran does not affect only the two governments. It reverberates through markets, military alliances, and political decisions on a global scale. There is also a human element that cannot be ignored. The Middle East, for a very long time, has lived under the weight of successive conflicts, displacement, economic pressure, and humanitarian crises. When tensions between two regional or extra-regional powers rise to the limit, the first to feel it is the civilian population, which begins to live with fear, uncertainty, and instability. So when people speak of an escalation between the US and Iran, they are not speaking only of diplomacy or military strategy. They are speaking of lives exposed to a power machine that could slip out of control. This is where this story begins. A story of threat, calculation, displays of force, and tense silence. A story in which every public word carries the weight of a chess move, and every military movement can change the course of the region. What is at stake is not only an agreement, it is the boundary between containment and explosion. Trump turned the tension with Iran into a continuous instrument of pressure, almost as if each new statement were designed to produce an immediate effect both inside and outside the region. This was not only a dispute between two governments, but a public demonstration of strength, where words, military movements, and diplomatic signals began to work together as tools of coercion. In the most recent accounts, the atmosphere became even more unsettling because American rhetoric no longer sounded like a simple warning and began to feel like a countdown. Trump insisted that Iran had to accept harsh conditions while warning that time was running out. That kind of language is not neutral. In geopolitics, An ultimatum is a weapon. It exists to push the adversary into an impossible choice: yield and appear weak, or resist and risk confrontation. This pressure gained weight because it did not remain confined to speeches. The United States reinforced its military presence in the Middle East, sending a clear signal that it was willing to back the threat with real capacity for action. In a region where aircraft carriers, bombers, air bases, and defense systems are read as political messages, every military reinforcement becomes a direct signal. And the signal was unmistakable. Washington wanted to show that it could still set the pace of the crisis. At the same time, Iran responded with calculated firmness. Tehran did not accept the logic of submission and insisted that it would not negotiate under direct threat. The Iranian government began to treat any American strike as the beginning of war, raising the level of risk with every statement. This stance did not come out of nowhere. It is part of a long-standing strategy of resistance, one that seeks to turn vulnerability into resolve and show that the country will not bend simply because its opponent speaks louder. What is most striking in this phase of the crisis is that the language of peace and the language of war began to move side by side. On one hand, there were conversations, mediation efforts, and attempts at agreement. On the other, there were public threats, troop movements, and increasingly harsh declarations. This contradiction creates a strange effect. The more negotiations are discussed, the closer rupture seems to become. It is as if diplomacy were being pushed into a room with no doors. International media began to note that the impasse between the United States and Iran could no longer be seen as an isolated dispute. The conflict started to touch larger interests such as energy security, maritime stability, and regional balance. The Strait of Hormuz, for example, returned to the center of attention as a global choke point. If that route were seriously threatened, the impact would not remain in the military sphere. It would spread through markets, supply chains, and governments that depend on the flow of oil from the region. But the most dangerous factor may be something else. In conflicts like this, the greatest risk is not only a planned attack, it is also miscalculation. When two sides keep troops on alert, speeches inflamed, and goals incompatible, all it takes is one wrong reading, one misunderstood movement, or one disproportionate response for everything to spin out of control. Recent Middle Eastern history shows that crises like this rarely explode cleanly. They break in fragments through successive escalations and decisions made at the edge of pressure. That is what made the current escalation so serious. It did not look like a simple diplomatic crisis. It looked like a chain of steps leading the world toward a point of no return. Iran was trying to preserve its position and avoid strategic humiliation. The United States was trying to impose conditions and reinforce its authority. And in the middle of that struggle, millions of people continued living in a region where risk is not an exception. It is the permanent setting. The crisis between the two countries revealed, with brutal clarity, that the Middle East remains a chessboard where major powers test limits and local countries try to survive the impact of those forces. Every new threat increases the sense that the situation is about to break. And when that happens, what once seemed like mere rhetoric starts to be seen as the omen of something much larger. The question hanging in the air is simple, but terrifying. How far can this escalation go before someone decides to pull the trigger? While Washington and Tehran exchanged threats and warnings, the real danger was spreading beyond the bilateral dispute and settling into the wider architecture of the Middle East. What looked at first glance like a duel between two governments had already become a regional shockwave, touching borders, shipping lanes, energy routes, and the fragile balance of countries that had nothing to do with the original confrontation but would still pay the price for it. The Iranian nuclear issue remained at the center of the dispute, but by this point, it was no longer the only thing driving the crisis. The conflict had become a matter of trust, survival, and deterrence. The United States wanted restrictions, guarantees, and proof that Iran would not cross the threshold into strategic nuclear capability. Iran wanted recognition, security, and relief from pressure. Neither side was willing to appear weak, and that made compromise increasingly difficult. Every new demand from Washington was seen in Tehran as an attempt to impose surrender. Every Iranian refusal was read in Washington as defiance that had to be answered. This is where the conflict began to take on a darker shape. The more both sides insisted on their positions, the more the regional environment seemed to harden around them. Military bases in the area became part of the equation. Naval routes became part of the equation. Air power became part of the equation. Even the language of diplomacy began to sound like a countdown disguised as negotiation. The region was no longer dealing with a single crisis. It was dealing with a chain reaction waiting for the next spark. One of the most sensitive points in this entire scenario was the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage that carries enormous strategic weight. It is not just a stretch of water, it is a lever of global influence. Any threat to navigation there immediately sends a message far beyond the Gulf. It affects markets, insurance costs, energy security, and the calculations of governments that rely on oil flows from the region. That is why the Strait of Hormuz has always been more than geography. It is pressure made physical. Iran knows this. The United States knows this. And so does everyone who watches the crisis from a distance. That is why the conversation around the strait is never only about ships. It is about leverage. It is about whether Iran can use its geography as a shield and a threat at the same time. It is about whether Washington can maintain open sea lanes without being drawn into a broader confrontation. It is about whether the region can absorb one more round of escalation without collapsing into a wider war. Beyond the military layer, the humanitarian picture continued to worsen. Instability in the Middle East does not remain abstract for long. It moves into hospitals, markets, refugee flows, and food insecurity. It drains public systems already weakened by years of conflict. It forces civilians to live with uncertainty while decisions are made far above their heads. That is one of the cruelest aspects of this kind of crisis. The language of statecraft may sound technical, but the consequences are brutally human. And yet the political theater continued. Public threats were made, counter-threats were issued, and every statement was measured not only for its content, but for its timing. Trump's approach remained one of direct pressure, a style that tried to dominate the narrative by speaking in absolutes and deadlines. Tehran answered in the language of endurance, framing resistance as a form of sovereignty. In that exchange, neither side was really speaking only to the other. They were speaking to domestic audiences, allies, rivals, and the global market all at once. That broader audience matters. In modern conflicts, every declaration is also a performance. Every threat is a message to investors. Every troop movement is a signal to allies. Every pause is interpreted as weakness or strategy. This is why the Iran-United States crisis became so difficult to contain. It was never just about one agreement. It was about credibility, prestige, and the fear that stepping back would mean losing control of the narrative. By now, the situation had entered a stage where accident and intention began to blur together. A missile launch, a naval incident, a misunderstood warning, or a misread radar signal could all change the direction of events. In a region already overloaded with tension, there is no such thing as a harmless mistake. There is only the distance between tension and disaster, and that distance can disappear in a single moment. This was the hidden logic of the crisis. Not a clean path to war, not a clean path to peace, but a corridor filled with pressure, uncertainty, and political theater. The region was not waiting for a grand announcement. It was waiting for the next move, the next reaction, the next point at which language would no longer be enough. As the crisis deepened, the Middle East began to feel less like a region reacting to events and more like a region trapped inside them. The conflict between the United States and Iran was no longer contained to speeches, sanctions, or military posturing. It was spilling outward, touching politics, security, trade, and the fragile sense of normality that many countries in the area have struggled to preserve for years. At this stage, the real concern was not only whether a major strike would happen, but whether a series of smaller confrontations could push the situation beyond control. That is how regional wars often begin, not with one dramatic declaration, but with repeated pressure, calculated warnings, and a constant expectation that the other side might misread the next move. In this case, every military signal became a message, and every message carried the possibility of escalation. The pressure on Iran had become a central feature of the American strategy. Washington continued to frame the crisis as a matter of nuclear control, regional security, and deterrence. But in practice, the language used to justify this pressure was inseparable from threats of force. That combination made the conflict more volatile because diplomacy was no longer standing apart from intimidation. It was traveling with it. And when diplomacy is backed too openly by military pressure, the line between negotiation and coercion becomes dangerously thin. Iran, for its part, understood the value of endurance. The Iranian leadership responded by presenting resistance as a form of national pride and strategic necessity. Tehran did not want to appear cornered, and it did not want to reward pressure by giving in quickly. That is why its public posture remained hard, defiant, and deeply suspicious of Washington's intentions. The message was not only directed at the United States, it was also directed at the Iranian population, allied militias, regional rivals, and every actor waiting to see whether the pressure would finally break the government's stance. The result was a regional atmosphere that felt saturated with tension. Countries surrounding the conflict were forced to calculate the consequences of any new move. A sudden naval incident could disrupt trade. A missile exchange could trigger retaliation. A broader strike could bring in allies and proxies. And in a region already shaped by decades of instability, the margin for error was alarmingly small. This is what made the crisis feel so dangerous. It was not just the possibility of war, but the possibility of war spreading through a network of connected fronts. The humanitarian dimension also grew harder to ignore. When instability rises in the Middle East, the effects do not stay in military circles. They move into civilian life, where they appear as fear, shortages, displacement, and uncertainty about what the next week will bring. Families begin to plan around danger. Businesses slow down. Governments tighten security. Borders become more sensitive. The crisis becomes visible not only in official statements, but in the way ordinary life starts to bend around the expectation of disruption. Meanwhile, the global implications remained enormous. Energy markets watched the region closely, knowing that any threat to maritime security could ripple far beyond the Gulf. The strategic importance of the area meant that even limited conflict could create international consequences. That is why the crisis between the United States and Iran never stayed local. It always had the potential to become global in impact, even if it began as a bilateral confrontation. Another striking feature of this stage was the mismatch between public language and underlying reality. On television, leaders spoke of control, strength, and eventual resolution. Behind the scenes, however, the atmosphere remained uncertain. Negotiations were fragile, military preparedness remained high, trust was minimal, and every new development seemed capable of shifting the balance in unexpected ways. That kind of contradiction creates a peculiar kind of suspense, because the world is told that the situation is under control, while the actual behavior of the actors suggests the opposite. This is where the crisis became more than a geopolitical dispute. It became a test of nerves, a test of how much pressure each side could absorb before changing course, a test of whether threats could still be used to shape events without tipping them into chaos. And perhaps most dangerously, a test of whether both sides were still capable of recognizing the point at which pressure stops working and catastrophe begins. By the time the crisis reached this level, it was clear that no one was dealing with a simple standoff anymore. They were dealing with a volatile system of fear, calculation, and mutual suspicion. The next step could still be diplomacy. It could still be a pause, but it could also be a mistake that would echo across the entire region. And that is what made the Middle East feel so exposed. Not certainty, but the constant possibility that the next move could be the one that changes everything. In the end, what the world was watching was not just a confrontation between two enemies, but a test of how far a region already exhausted by conflict could be pushed before something finally broke. The crisis between the United States and Iran had become a mirror of the wider Middle East, reflecting all of its old wounds, its strategic obsessions, and its endless cycle of threats that never seem fully separated from reality. The drama of this moment lay in its uncertainty. There was no clean ending, no decisive resolution, no point at which the danger could be declared over. Instead, there was a tense equilibrium built on military readiness, diplomatic fatigue, and the constant possibility of misunderstanding. That is what made the situation so serious. It was not only the threat of an announced war, it was the threat of a war that could begin through accident, miscalculation, or a political decision made under pressure. Trump's hardline posture remained one of the defining forces in the crisis. His language was direct, forceful, and aimed at creating the impression that Washington still held the upper hand. But power in a crisis like this is never only about speeches. It is about whether the other side believes the threat is real, whether the region is willing to absorb the shock, and whether escalation can still be controlled once the pressure rises. In that sense, every public statement became part of a larger contest over perception. Iran, meanwhile, continued to frame itself as a state under siege. Its response was shaped by the need to preserve dignity, deterrence, and strategic freedom. Tehran could not afford to look submissive, especially in front of its own population and its allies. That is why the Iranian position remained rooted in defiance, even as the risks around it multiplied. The message was clear: pressure would not be met with surrender, but with resistance. Whether that resistance would prevent war or invite more of it remained the central question. What stands out most in this entire crisis is how quickly the language of escalation becomes normal. A warning sounds ordinary, a deployment sounds routine, a threat sounds familiar, but underneath that repetition is a region where each new development carries the weight of a possible turning point. This normalization of danger is one of the most unsettling things about modern geopolitical conflict. The world gets used to the language of collapse before the collapse ever arrives. That is why the Middle East remains one of the most sensitive theaters in global politics. It is not only because of oil or military bases or nuclear fears. It is because every crisis in the region tends to sit on top of other crises already in motion. One conflict feeds another. One retaliation creates a new balance of fear. One unresolved issue becomes the seed of the next emergency. And when the United States and Iran face each other inside that environment, the stakes become larger than either country alone. The future of this confrontation remains open, but not calm. It is open in the worst possible sense. Open to diplomacy, yes, but also open to miscalculation, retaliation, and sudden expansion. That is the reality behind the headlines and the dramatic language. The region is not simply waiting for a final answer. It is waiting for the next turn, aware that in a conflict this tense, the next turn could be the one that changes everything. And so the story ends, for now, without real closure. Not because the danger is gone, but because the danger is still alive. The United States and Iran remain locked in a struggle where words can behave like weapons, and weapons can arrive faster than diplomacy can respond. In that space between threat and action, the Middle East continues to hold its breath.